church of St. Luke was built was donated by Elizabeth Brant Kerr, having received it from Joseph Brant, her father, to whom the land was given in thanks for his services to the British Canadian forces during the American Revolution. We recognize the complexity of holding together these two historical realities. We give thanks for all God's children who have preceded us in this place and for their care and love for this land on which we gather. We commend ourselves to God so we may continue learning and growing in mutual love with our Aboriginal and First Nation siblings. So I am happy to be able to introduce our guest speaker today. Before I do that, just quickly, thank you for coming out today. We welcome you. Thank you for picking up your speaker's lunch name tag, which you can deliver back in the box on your way out, and I'll remind you at the end. But on behalf of our committee, thank you for coming out and for your donations to help us offset our costs. We're very, very fortunate to have our guest speaker today. Given the history of St. Luke's and Joseph Brant, given that this is also Burlington's 150th anniversary year, and also recognize that September the 30th is the National Truth and Reconciliation Day in Canada. So it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Rick Monture. Am I pronouncing that right, Rick? Monture? Yeah. Rick is a member of the Mohawk Nation, the Turtle Clan from 6 nations of the Grand River Territory. He is also an associate professor in the Department of English and Cultural Studies and Indigenous Studies at McMaster University, where he teaches class on Haudenosaunee history and oral traditions, Indigenous literature, and Bob Dylan. Yeah, I had the same question. It's an interest of his, but he likes teaching about Bob Dylan. Anyway, he just rushed here from Mac, probably left a bunch of students in the lurch. He is also a community scholar with 6 Nations Polytechnique and a former member of the steering committee that established the Dehanahaj Indigenous Knowledge Center based at 6 Nations. Rick is an active community volunteer and is a board member with the Grand River Post-Secondary Education Office, as well as a founding member of the Old Council House Restoration Committee that is now undertaking to restore and preserve the 6 Nations Council House that was built by the Grand River Confederacy chiefs in 1863. He currently holds a Social Science and Humanities Research Council of Canada Award for a project that undertakes to examine the events that led to the overthrow of traditional government by Ottawa to implement an elected council system in 1924. His book, We Share Our Matters, 2 Centuries of Writing and Resistance at 6 Nations of the Grand River, was published by the University of Manitoba Press in 2014, and it is an examination of the Grand River Haudenosaunee assertions of sovereignty and social justice through letters, political activism, literature, and film. Rick lives in the 6 Nations with his family. Please have a warm welcome for Rick Monture.
Thanks, Tim, and thanks, Bob, and thanks everybody for coming out today. My apologies for running late, but as I was saying, I teach a class on Thursday morning, so I have to leave a little bit early to race here. And so I appreciate your patience. You have a lovely little church here. I parked on Elgin and walked in, and I've driven by here several times because my cousin lived in an apartment building just down the street here a few years ago, so I've been here for sure and had lots of friends in Burlington, but never actually walked these grounds, so it's a nice spot for sure. Like Tim said, I'm from 6 Nations, born and raised, grew up on the reserve, about 45 minutes south of here. It's the biggest reserve in Canada, the most popular reserve in Canada, the 2nd largest land-wise. We have a long history of contact with the first the French and then of course the British, who were allies in the American Revolution, the War of 1812, the First World War, Second World War, and every conflict since then. So we have a long history. As you probably know, Joseph Brant was an Anglican. He was a Freemason. He was a graduate of Eliezer Wheelock's Indian School, which went on to become Dartmouth College in the States, an Ivy League institution there. So he's quite the compelling figure, and his fingerprints are all over this town, as well as Brantford, as well as Six Nations. So I'm going to talk a little bit about him, his legacy today. Those dates, I realized, it's not his dates. He wasn't 30-something when he passed. Those dates are just the kind of story I'm going to tell in this moment of time for the time that we have today. And I'm just going to put up some visuals and tell a little bit of that history. But first I wanted to begin with something that I do from time to time when I get a gathering, because I know a lot of people have heard of our people, the Mohawk, and heard the Six Nations and the Haudenosaunee and all this, but you probably haven't heard our language. And of course, since this is coming up on September 30th, Truth and Reconciliation Day, one of the big mandates of that time is to foreground Indigenous languages, the languages that were taken away from my grandparents in residential schools. So I'll begin with that. And what this is something we call the Ohando Gilibatakwa, which means the words that come before all else. So anytime a group of people get together for a ceremony, for a gathering, for a meeting, whether it be political, social, whatever, any kind of event where people come together, these are the words that were given by our Creator to honor everybody here, and to give thanks as a group of people for everything that is happening in the world right now. Of course, this is harvest time, and so we're especially thankful. We're having a series of ceremonies next week to commemorate that, and we have done that since time immemorial. So a little bit of what I'm going to do, I'll just give a short version of that. It's about an hour generally. We can tailor it down to however much time we have, and I know we don't have a lot of time, but I think it's important because this is how our people give thanks, how our people see the world, and it's done in our language. We've maintained that despite everything that's happened to us, and this is the language of Joseph Brand. Ne ona kataga jokoda zawad honsios ke wakala wayana way undone. Yole wakeha de wadu walado ito gadi ni odohoge ne ona go. Ne ona they would slowly geomajade ne wahe jogwal zadaga zala wahe di nistenta de itmaduko. Ito wanuwe a gwego yan twaine so kwa ediso ne a yago hi Luncheon is kano adewano tonuhage. Ne e yo weza sego e non daya go yalan haje na hoda ne so kwa ediso seko lihunde. Ne kadi ne didu wadu yando iti no walado geomajade iti nistenta de itmaduko. Ito kadi ni odohage ne go. Ne ona and they would slowly ne lo dali condonio de ho desnenta ke isti na haviana ne. Ne kadi ne wahage anska yanchiti nu walado. Ito kadi ni odohage ne go. Ne ona and they would slowly ne songo go anas kani dalio yoti hawana but the dele watsa ne no so yon wahage ne o handa o wana so yon dunji. Ne kadi ne didu wadu yando denchiti nu walado ne songo go anas kani dalio. Ito kadi ni odohage ne go. Ne ona and they would slowly ne gaeli no wete kilo dilo hake lono. Ne wahe no gyada no ajes ne skano adu no tuluhake. Ne oni kakne galage ne gwego galawa dakwe ne le didi kolesun aje. Ne kadi ne didu wadu yando deiti no walado ne gaeli no wete kilo dilo hake lono. Ito kadi ni odohake ne kono kono. Ne ona ne would slowly ne lauhake galahage tanagale ne so diso. Ne wahe yoche yonya ti seko to hunsun aje ne skano adu no tuluhake. Ne wahe ne tade ni silage ne gwego ti ko kanaji ne ludine densala. Ne kadi ne didu wadu yando dechi ne du walado ne galahage tanagale ne so diso. Ito kadi ne odohage ne kono kono. Ona kadi ito nakad koini I wakali wakelo wakali ne gahwai ne kadu kule donsala ona ito. So those words are the very first words that were given to our people when our Creator made us. He made us from the land, He made us from the soil, He breathed life into us, and He gave us these words, some of which I just spoke, and He said, as human beings, there's nothing that you can do, really, other than to appreciate this world. Everything here has been made for you. Everything is here for your enjoyment, for your well-being. The birds are singing to make you feel good. There are trees to make your homes out of, to keep you warm at night. There are animals that you can eat. There are plants that you can eat. Medicines that grow in the ground to make you feel better. So all you can do as human beings, because you can't make any of those things, but you can appreciate them. And all you need to do is give thanks. So, whenever we do a job and someone appreciates it, says, thanks for doing that, you feel good. That's what those animals and that's what those trees, and that's what all the forces in nature, the sun, the moon, the stars, the planets, everything that is in there. I did a short version, but that's the idea, that everything in creation is in there. We give thanks, and that's all we can do as human beings. And when you don't do that, when you're forgetful, that's when nature gets upset. We see that in climate change. We see forest fires. We see heat waves, drought, famine, earthquakes. That's what happens when human beings become forgetful. We don't give thanks. We lose our spiritual connection to everything around us. So that's all incorporated in there. And these are the things that Joseph Brand would have been familiar with as well. Despite him being Christian, despite him being a Mason, despite him being literate and understanding and writing English, he knew these things too. He would have heard all of these ideas as well. And that's what he tried to share with the British throughout his life. But he's not really given credit for that. He's seen as something different, right? He's seen as an Anglican who adopted English ways. But and I've done a lot of research, I wrote a lot about him and talked about him, he tried to incorporate both things. He wasn't an assimilated person. He was someone who tried to bring the best of both worlds together because he understood where we are as a people in this day and age after the American Revolution, the more modern era of our existence, right? Anyway, so that's just how I want to begin. So I'm going to pick up this story really quickly. I don't know how much people know about Joseph Brand, but he was born in 1742 in the Ohio Valley with his family. He's a Mohawk Wolf clan, a Mohawk Turtle clan. These clan systems are embedded in our Haudenosaunee ideology and our social formation. They predate nationhood. So, and we're a matrilineal people. We follow our mother. So my mother and my grandmother, all my maternal line were Mohawk Turtle Clan women. My dad's a Mohawk Bear Clan, but I, of the Turtle Clan, from my female line, from a matrilineal line. So that's how we see the world. We're a very, I guess, call it a feminist society before there was such a thing, or known as such a thing. But we always followed the women. So he was born in Ohio, and is now present-day Ohio, and then moved back to New York State, close to Schenectady or Albany, New York, if people know that region of the world. That's where he grew up. And he was a young man. He fought in the French and Indian War of 1763 as a teenager, I guess. So he was a veteran early on. He fought alongside the British against the French at the Plains of Abraham and such. So he was a warrior. And at that time, he was became educated. He was introduced to Christianity and becoming a Mason. All of those things. But he was also, and a lot of people, this is one thing a lot of people don't know about Joseph Brand, because they see Chief Joseph Brand, Tandanega, but he was never really a chief in the traditional sense of our people. He was a leader, yeah, but we call him a pine tree chief. We have a system of government that's already in place. He wasn't one of our traditional leaders, but he was more or less a war chief. So when we came into conflict with his British allies, he was held up and elevated as a war chief, let's say. So he wasn't a traditional leader in the way that we look at him, but he's seen as a chief by other people, and that's his legacy as a historical figure here in Canada, here in Burlington, right? But that's something that a lot of people know about. Another thing I'll point out, and I often share this with everybody because not everybody knows this, but speaking of language and speaking of place, we're on the shores of Lake Ontario. That's a native word, right? Does anyone know what Ontario means? No one does. I ask young people this, it's not taught. It's the name of our province, it's on our license, it's on all sorts of things. It's Ondalio. And that's a Huron word actually, which is a close cultural and linguistic cousin of our people, the Iroquois, and it means beautiful water. So Indigenous is water, and Leo, Unda, yeah, it's like a body of water. Leo in our language is beautiful, something beautiful. So basically that, beautiful water. And do you remember back when, I'm old enough to remember now, our license plates in the 70s said Ontario, keep it beautiful? That's what I often wonder is somebody in Queen's Park or wherever must have understood the origins of that word maybe to kind of reference that. I'm not sure. And I've done a lot of research. I don't know exactly when Ontario was named, who named it and why, but clearly they lifted an Indigenous concept in place name for their province, which is a big province, right, in the lake right here, obviously. So anyway, that's another thing to share. You can tell all your friends tonight. But yeah, no one knows it. I ask people every year at McMaster, I've been teaching there for 20 plus years now, and I ask them, does anyone know the origins of this word? Is it taught? Never is. No one knows it. But this is part of that truth and reconciliation. No one, these sorts of very obvious things aren't taken up at that level. We need to do that more often. Because, anyway, I could go on about that environmental stewardship and stuff, but we don't have time. Anyway, we're here for Joseph Brand. So, this is our man right here. For a native person at that time, he was well known. He was, whenever he went anywhere, whether it be America or Canada wasn't a thing, but he went to England a few times. He had his portrait painted. That's one of his more famous portraits that was done in his lifetime. And so, this kind of regal figure that made the rounds in different countries. He was a celebrity, he's known as a leader of the Six Nations. But the other thing too is he was always advocating for our people's political future, is the important thing. So he wasn't saying all of our people need to adopt English and Christianity and do everything like the Englishman to survive. He was also advocating for our sovereignty, for our political autonomy, for our right to do as we wanted to do as Native people, which is also important, but again, that's kind of overlooked. But he was an activist in his own time. But people just saw the assimilated Joseph Brand. They didn't see his activist side so much. Anyway, a lot to be said about that, but we don't have time today. Next slide, please. So this is another portrait later in his life. He's got less hair, but this is supposed to commemorate his first visit to Brantford, Ontario. Anyone here from Brantford know Brantford, the actual city that's named after Joseph Brand? That's where our initial village was. So the story of that is, like I said, our people's traditional territories is what is now known as present-day New York State. We were here a little bit in the southern Ontario, but our traditional territories was all of New York State. Joseph Brand, being Mohawk, was from the eastern part of New York State near Albany. Like I said, Albany, Schenectady, if people know that, the Catskill Mountains and the Adirondacks to the north, that's our territory. And Mohawk is an English word for us. We call ourselves Ginyengehaga people of the Flint. And that references a place in that region between the Catskills and the Adirondacks where Indigenous people forever had gathered their arrow points for hunting near that region. So it ties us into that particular geographical place, Ginyengehaga. That's what that means, people of the Flint. That's where he grew up, that's where he's from. So all of our people were allied with the British. We've been there since time immemorial. We did cross the Bering Strait. We have creation stories that put us in those places. I won't go into that, but we've always lived in the Northeast. We've always lived in this part of the world. And the mountain range that we come from, the Adirondacks, is the oldest mountain range in North America. People think the Rockies are old, but the Rockies are young as far as mountains go. That's why they're so tall and jagged. They haven't been worn down over time. Any geologist will tell you that mountain ranges that are kind of sunken and worn over are older. So that's where we come from. So we're an old people who've been around there a long, long time. We have lots of stories about this, but I won't get into that. But we allied ourselves with the British in the American Revolution. We know what happened in the American Revolution, and that's when we came over here. The British, and Joseph Brand had a love-hate relationship with the British. He was allies with the British because we had this allyship that was 200 years old, basically. 150 years old at the time of the American Revolution. We maintained that relationship with the British because we signed the Treaty of Wampum with them. This is a Wampum Belt Agreement, the Treaty of Wampum, and this is this relationship we had with the British beginning in the 1650s. Us as Native people, Iroquois people, Six Nations people, were in our vessel in a canoe. The Europeans were in their vessel in a canoe, separate but equal. We won't meddle in each other's affairs, but we'll be allies as we travel together down this river. So, remembering that relationship, Joseph Brand convinced the rest of our people to ally themselves with the British in the American Revolution. They said, we know what happened, the British lost or surrendered on us in the field, and but left us out to dry. They didn't uphold their end of the bargain. So at this point, because we fought against the Americans, they were upset with us. They were, we were refugees in our own territory. We looked to the British to help us honor their allied relationship, and they assigned General Frederick Haldeman to track out this land along the Grand River here in southern Ontario. So that was done in 1783-84, and in October 1784, we began moving from New York State into southern Ontario along the Grand River. And that's when we settled in Brantford. That's what this portrait is from that time. That's supposed to be Joseph Brant pointing the way across the Grand River to settle in Brantford. Artist rendition, right? But it's a famous portrait. So that's the banks of the beautiful Grand River near Brantford. Next slide, please. Another portrait, like I said, he was well known. I happened to be in Philadelphia about 5 or 6 years ago doing research at one of the big research libraries there, and I went to this portrait gallery, and lo and behold, this portrait was there, the original. So I was like blown away to know that's where it existed. It's about the size of that window. It's quite large. And that's, anyway, on one of his visits to Philadelphia, that used to be the old capital of America, right? One of his visits prior to the Revolution, Brant was painted, and that's where it sits. So anyway, he got around, that fellow. So anyway, we moved here in 1784, 85, that's how long we've been settled in. And Brant took up residence at Brantford and built the Mohawk Chapel and built a village there. And as I think Tim had mentioned in the land acknowledgement, the reason he came to Burlington was not as his standing as a chief or anything, but because he had fought as a British officer. He was made a British officer in the American Revolution. So all British officers from that time period, from that conflict, were given land grants here, right, in this region, Empire Loyalists. So Brant's land grant was just over here, where the hospital is now, basically. That was his land plot, and I guess I understand that his daughter gave this land for the church because they were Anglicans, right? So Burlington was Brant's retirement home, basically. So even though he lived in Brantford for many years, he had a house built and retired here. Well, not retired as much as you can retire from a post like that. In the early 1800s, he was in his 60s at that time and not the best of health. So, and he passed away here. If you're from the area, you know Highway 2, the old Highway 2 that runs from Brantford through, that's basically the old trail, our old trail from Brantford to here. So anyway, yeah, so that's his story here in Burlington. Next slide, please. This is a map from 1771. So you probably can't see it too well, but I just want to post this up here because this is a British map from that time, pre-revolution. If you can see, the Six Nations are written across all of, when I said New York State, all of those trails are the trail system that we had established. You see the Senecas up here. The Mohawks would have been in this area, Albany. The sound really disappears when you don't have the microphone. Wow, it's quite a room. So anyway, that's our traditional territory, all of that, what is now New York State. And notice this is a British map, and they call us nations, right? They understood we were political entities, not tribes, not uncivilized people, but nations, who they dealt with as nation-to-nation people. They relied upon us to teach them how to get around, how to survive, diplomacy. We told them our stories of the Great Law and our leadership and our governance and all these stories because our Confederacy and our Great Law of Peace is at least 1,000 years old. And we told them all these stories. The same things that we talk about now, we told the British in these agreements, right? So anyway, a lot to be said about that, but that's our traditional territories, and I just wanted to point out, even the British map that out. You can kind of see us here, where we are, up there, the top left, yeah, Niagara and all that kind of stuff. So this was all known territory to us, but that was our traditional homelands. Okay, next slide, please. So as I said, in 1784, we were given this tract of land in the gray along the Grand River, 6 miles wide on either side of the Grand River mouth to its source, about 1 million square acres in 1784 under King George III. And if you can just Google the Haldimand deed, it's a one-page document, and it says that this land is given to the Mohawks and others of the Six Nations, which them and their posterity are to enjoy forever. Right? By the British. King George III saw his seal, forever, 1 million square acres. Forever lasted about 15 years, and they started taking it away. And so the orange is, that's the present day reserve, about less than 5% of that initial land grant. So that sort of speaks for itself, and you can sort of see all it runs through Kitchener-Waterloo right up into north of Fergus. And so that's under a land claim. Some of that area was sold and paid for, maybe 5-7%. Much of it was stolen, much of it was fraudulently taken, much of it was said to be bought and paid for but never was. When we came to Canada, what is now Canada, Upper Canada, we were also given about £20,000 in trust fund to sort of why the British could build up our infrastructure, because remember, we were refugees, we walked. All of our villages were burned down by the American Army. So when we came here to Grand River, we had to build up our communities from the ground up. We had to buy implements, we had to build fences, we had to clear land, so we were given some money to do that in a trust fund account. We did that, we established villages, from Dunville to Brantford basically. But because we didn't have banks, people didn't use money, a lot of this money was taken from our accounts without our knowledge by the British and later Canadian officials. So the money from our trust fund account helped build the Welland Canal, the Bank of Montreal, what else, McGill University, all these sorts of things were taken from, that was our money. That was given to us by the British, but Canadian officials took it. And that's another part of our land claim. And this is historical fact, I'm not just making this stuff up. This is known by Canada and the British. The British, they're good bankers, right? So they kept track of all the money that came and went. But in 1867, when they transferred all of these records to Canada, those records somehow immediately disappeared. But we do have an accounting of all the money that transpired from 1784 to 1867. And we can see that the money was taken, and Canada knows that. But they've yet to account for that. Okay, next slide, please. This may look familiar. This is the Mohawk Chapel in Brantford. This is the church that Brad built. Anyone been here? In Brantford? Very similar to this one from what I can see. Built in 1785, 1786, still standing. Still in pretty good shape. Just a few months ago, prior to his coronation, King Charles's personal minister came out to visit us here. We toured him around. The Queen had been here several times over the years. It's a royal chapel. I should have put some interior shots inside too, but it's very simple in its design, but it's held up all this time. So that's near Brantford, Ontario. Okay, next. Just as maybe go back really quickly. Just as a point of interest, Brad did build a church in our traditional territory in New York State. Looks very much like this one, a white clapboard, white wooden structure. So if you're happy to be driving along New York State Thruway and you're past Utica, New York, if you look, there's I think it's Indian Castle turnoff. If you look to your right-hand side as you're heading to New York City, there's a church that sits up on the hill. That's the church that Brant built in the 1760s. It's still standing as well. So, these things are able, it survived the revolution. It caught fire about 20 years ago, but survived, so it's still standing as well. Okay. So this is just another map of our tradition, our communities. As you can see, what is all New York State. So these little dots in the red and the blue and the purple, that's all our existing reserve now. So there's Six Nations, obviously, where I'm from. There's other Seneca reserves in the blue in the States, because some people stayed in America after the Revolution, and there's Mohawk communities in the red up there. So small communities, but we're still here. And we still maintain our ceremonies, we still maintain our traditions and our customs and our language as best we can. So yeah, we're doing, we're hanging on. We're very much alive and well in 2023. And yeah, and I guess all these things that we talk about, the news reconciliation, all these things, we've always maintained that. We had a residential school in Brantford. Like I said, my grandfather went, my maternal grandfather went, but my paternal grandmother at the same time was going to high school in Brantford. The whole residential school system here anyway at Six Nations was very irregular. So it was kind of, the kids weren't really taken out of the home so much like they were in other places, but they were taken there if they were living in poverty, which my grandfather was at the time. And I knew him very well, and he was a fluent Mohawk speaker, but he never taught my mother or my aunts, the language. He talked about how, because he was orphaned, his father died when he was young, and his mother just couldn't take care of him and his sister, so he went to the residential school in the 1910s. And it's interesting because he passed away in '89, and I knew him very well, and we talked a lot, but I never really talked to him about this too much. But he did say that he didn't go to school. He was always in the barn working as a young, like he was 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. Didn't learn much at school, but was always milking cows, taking care of horses, all that kind of stuff. So child labor, that's what they did in this place. So it was run by the Anglican Church, and they utilized all the stuff from the farm, the eggs, the chicken, the cattle, to make money, but the kids didn't get a chance to eat those things. So even though he tended to all of those livestock, they didn't eat meat, they didn't have eggs. It was just labor, indentured labor basically. So but he did say, that's why I learned to run a farm. But he ran away 3 times. He never talked about what happened to him once he ran away, but he couldn't have been that great if he ran away 3 times. So anyway, but he raised a family, he never drank, never swore, never said anything bad about anybody. He was a survivor. And he looked forward to, whenever they did have reunions there, so he wanted to meet his old classmates whenever they got together. I do remember that. But he taught himself carpentry, basic electrical. He read a lot. So, but he'd been dealt that big blow. But anyway, and I'm thinking about him a lot these days because the house he built for my parents, I'm now renovating. So he built this house in 1964 that I grew up in, and my wife and family moved back in there and expanded it. So we're renovating his old part of the house, and you can see his handwriting in the bathroom wall and all the wooden structures and stuff. It's pretty neat. So that's why I'm thinking a lot about him these days. And the day he passed away, this is the kind of guy he was. He had a bad heart as a kid. He wasn't expected to really make it past being a teenager, but he lived to be 89. And the day he passed away, this was the middle of January, he called me up and goes, "Rick, I want to take that apple tree down in the backyard. It's going to fall over, and I don't want it to fall over this winter." So I helped him on a Saturday morning cut down this apple tree that had been in the backyard forever. And then he wasn't feeling well. He went inside to have lunch and passed away of a heart attack at 89. But that day he passed, he was on the tractor in the middle of January helping us cut this tree down. And I think that's the kind of guy he was, just work, and always thinking about his family and the well-being of his family and stuff. So he was a tremendous fellow. Elam Froman, his name was. Anyway, I didn't mean this isn't Joseph Brandt, but he was a big fan of Joseph Brandt and understood being a Mohawk person and had a staunchly political sense of ourselves. We weren't Canadian. We weren't, what they told us we were. We were proud people. We could be resilient and take care of ourselves and our family. So he didn't let residential school affect him. He took what was offered to him there and raised a family and kept that family together through thick and thin. He was a farmer. The barn he built still stands. Our house still stands. The house he built still stands. So we do our best to honor him each and every day. The farm that he built with his bare hands, basically. I could tell you more stories, but we got to move on. Next. Yeah, so these are just some of our wampum belts. I don't know how much time we have. I lost complete track of time, but I wanted to show this because these are our agreements with Canada, and these are the things that Joseph Brandt would have abided by. This symbol here you've probably seen before. It's a wampum belt. This is a pre-contact agreement amongst our people. We confederated as a group of nations that the United States patterned their country off of, like, separate states, separate nations within a larger confederacy of nations, a republic, right? These are the things that we influenced Benjamin Franklin and the other founding fathers of the American Confederacy about. We told them these things, and that's when they got the idea to become independent from England, based upon our ideology of political governance and leadership. The one thing they did get wrong, though, was, like I said, we're a matrilineal people, and our people, the women chose the leaders. Our women chose the chiefs, because it was said that, well, it is said, because we still have our traditional government in place, the women see a young man growing up from the time he's crawling on the ground to the time he becomes a young man, to the time he starts his own family. The women are watching him, and the women understand who's generous and kind, who's, isn't a selfish bully. And the women said, those are the kinds of people that we want to be our leaders, and they chose that boy, that man, to become the leader. So, and it was always the women who chose our chiefs, always the women who ran our political governance from a woman's perspective. But the Americans didn't take that part of it, right? It was, women couldn't vote, let alone choose the leader or have any kind of influence on their leadership until quite recently, about the 1920s, 100 years ago. So anyway, again, much more to talk about. But these are the things that Joseph Brand knew about. He embodied these things. He shared those with the British. He understood those things. Because Joseph Brand's always held up as this big leader, this important guy. And sure, he was at a particular moment in time, but he was also one individual within this larger collective, thinking, this philosophy, this society, this government, this group of people known as Haudenosaunee, Monaskiniangahage people that, with the opening address that I gave to some of these political philosophies and stuff, the tenacity that he held on to these things, but knowing we weren't stuck in time either, right? Knew that things were coming. He had a British education, and would incorporate those things. I think that's what makes him such a compelling figure, because we kind of want to pigeonhole him. We want to see him, he was an Anglican, so he thought like an Anglican. Yeah, he was those things, but he didn't think entirely like an Anglican. He thought as a British person, he thought as a Mohawk person too, with all these stories that I'm talking about. Next slide, please. You probably heard the dish with one spoon. I think you mentioned that, Tim, in the acknowledgement. This is an understanding of our people. This is a wampum belt for leaders. So basically, the idea here is that we all live in this one dish, and all leaders are to eat from this dish, this metaphoric dish. And there are not to be any sharp words or sharp objects, no knives or forks. Again, this is metaphor. And this is back at a time, way back when our next meal wasn't going to come, a sandwich in a bag or Tim Hortons or McDonald's or anything, or a trip down to, Fortino's. This is back in a time when food in your next meal was not a guarantee. If the crops weren't good one year, the hunters were unsuccessful, you could go hungry, you and your family could go hungry. So food and eating together was a big part of our people's thinking, right? It was something that was always on their mind, so you couldn't take that for granted. So the leaders were to understand them coming together as leaders to eat a meal that we're to be appreciative of, and we're to keep that bowl clean for other future generations. And leaders are not to have harsh words between them at the dinner table, like good, dinner etiquette, table etiquette. You weren't supposed to argue, because once you argue, the people see that, and they'll become argumentative too, right? And you see that in this country today. You see that in the States, you see that in Canada. When our leaders argue and are critical of one another in public displays of this, the people follow, and our people become argumentative as well. But these are the things that in our people's minds, in Joseph Brandt's mind, you're not to do. Because, as leaders lead, people will follow, and you don't want that. So it's a huge responsibility to uphold that peacefulness while you're eating. And it's also a message to the environment. Because remember what I said? On the Leo, beautiful lake, beautiful water, we're to keep it that way. And it's not about sharing resources. It's not about everybody can partake of this. It's not about that. It's about having an environmental consciousness and responsibility to keep those things clean for succeeding generations. Right? We're always made to think 7 generations ahead. So the decisions that I make now and we make, we should always be thinking about how's that going to impact upon, our children and, children's children for 7 generations. This very futuristic thinking, not just in the here and now, So lots of stuff embodied here, and again, these are things that Joseph Grant would have been aware of. Next slide. This is the Turo Wampum, which I already talked about really quickly and covered. Next. This is the Friendship Treaty Belt. So this was an agreement between us and the British in the 1660s, 1670s, a long time ago. The Friendship Belt. This is to align our people, the native people, and the non-native people. So see, there's a distance here, but there's this connectivity, this connecting chain of friendship, we call it, between us. There's a fair distance there, but the idea is that that's always within our ability to kind of, if we need to talk with the other about something, to discuss something, to negotiate something, to renew our relationship, we just give this a little pull, and the other nation will come to have a visit. That is about transparency and communication, this friendship belt. And I like to use this image because this is the way it's supposed to look when it's intact. This is a much older belt, probably 200 years old, maybe 150 maybe, in a museum. But as you can see, it's kind of falling apart. So that line of communication between native people and non-native people is kind of broken, right? Metaphoric, of course, and just over time, but it kind of demonstrates this breakdown in our ability to communicate too. Next. So returning to Joseph Brand, this is him later in life. A few more pounds, a little bit less hair. About the time he moved back to his abode here on the shores of Lake Ontario. This here, I don't know, something's funny going on, but you can go to the next one from there. That's okay. So the next slide here is, anyone recognize that from anywhere? Yeah? Brantford, yeah. That's the Brant Monument in Victoria Park in Brantford, Ontario. This was erected in 1886. I have a show and tell piece I'll pass around to him. So on the occasion of this dedication of this monument, and those figures are made from cannons from the War of 1812 that were melted down and put into these statuettes. That's Brant on top. And there's some other Mohawks on the base there and stuff like that to commemorate his involvement as an ally and Six Nations connection to the British. So what I have here is a medal that was given out at that date in 1886. I bought it from a guy on the reserve. It's fairly common. You see them come up on eBay, but I'll pass it around. It's got a price tag of $30 on it. I left it down there just for fun. I think it's probably worth about more like $300 or more these days. But anyway, it's a little show and tell piece. So the city of Brantford commemorated Brant's legacy to their town at that time. I don't think anything like that exists here in Burlington. I don't believe. His house was, I think, burned down or taken down, the original structure, and sold. And the replica that was up prior to where it is now was built, I want to say the 50s or 60s. Other people might know better. And then now the most current museum, which exists. So again, his legacy is big, but not everybody knows the nuance of his story. And that's what I wanted to share a little bit today with you folks. But you can still visit that. Like I said, we took Reverend Paul Wright was King Charles's, the royal family's minister, as mentioned. We took him there back in, when was he here? March, April, when he visited Mohawk Chapel. This is about 5-10 minutes from Victoria Park. Okay, next. So I talked about the political governance of Six Nations. So this is the council house that stands in the center of our reserve. Ashwaubenon is still standing. It was built in 1863 by our traditional leadership, by carpenters and bricklayers from Six Nations. Still standing. Was built in 1863, 4 years before Confederation, so I'd like to say that our Parliament building is older than Canada. And before that was a log structure. And that's where our Confederacy chiefs met until 1924 when the RCMP came in and dismantled, or tried to, I guess, to dismantle the Confederate Traditional Council that's 1,000 years old in favor of an elected system. Next. So here's a picture that's even a little bit older than that, because you can see this, and I think it's about 1872. It was originally a wooden structure, now has brick on it, and as Tim mentioned, I'm part of a restoration committee that's working on the old building now. It's still very structurally sound. It's in great shape, really, so we're lucky that way. But anyway, in its first incarnation, it was a wooden building. That brick has since been laid over. But this is an interesting picture, but you can't probably see, but there's the placard there in the middle, and I apologize, it's probably right in your there's a placard in the middle that says Sir John for Big Chief. So back in those days, because people probably know that we weren't allowed to vote in federal elections until 1951. Native people were considered too primitive or uncivilized or not smart enough to vote in Canadian elections until 1951. But for a brief window there, people at Six Nations could vote. Probably because they saw us as allies of the British and this and that. So our people were able to vote in this earlier federal election for John A. MacDonald. You can sort of see people are lobbying for him at that time. Not a popular opinion these days amongst Native people, but anyway, that's our old council house. Also note the Six Nations marching band. In the front there's tubas and this military style band. It said that we had 3 marching bands at that time on the reserve. These are all Native men, mostly Native men. So yeah, lots of interesting history from that time period. Okay, next. There's an interior shot of that same council house. This is from about 1912. So this is the traditional Confederacy chiefs. These are our spiritually initiated, the descendants of our spiritually initiated government put in place by the peacemaker in the terms of the Great Law. But interesting things happening here, right? So this is the interior of the council house. There's a huge Union Jack. There's a military flag on the right. There's a picture of the king and queen. There's clan flags hanging. Tom Longboat, the famous runner, his portrait's on the top left. He won the Around the Bay race and the Boston Marathon. Back then, he was from Six Nations. A few other dignitaries. See the gentleman in the top right, just the full portrait, like the photo of that guy is Dr. Peter Martin. And Peter Martin was a fellow from Six Nations who went on to begin the IODA, the Foresters of Canada. He built that big building in Toronto. He was a medical doctor, but he was from Six Nations. So he was a celebrity at this time as well. And the string of wampum, that man in the middle, that's the what we call our mace, I guess. I can't recall our word for it, but it's a symbol of our government being in session. So if you think of all the sort of all the symbology behind meetings and governments and monarchy, I guess almost. I'm thinking of the coronation, all the kind of symbolic nature of some of what happens. That is a symbol of our government being in session. It's only brought out when the government's in session. And so anyway, in 1924, when the RCMP came in to eliminate these guys, get rid of them as the traditional, or the government of Six Nations, they stole that. They stole that string of wampum. The RCMP took it as a way to kind of undermine our legitimacy or whatever. And it wasn't given back, it wasn't returned to us until the 80s. So some 60 years has been missing from its rightful owners, but we now have it back. It was locked away in a safe in Brantford for all that time. So anyway, just, again, all the sort of subterfuge and all the things, the conflict that our people have undergone over time is all happened, all that kind of history, this big history happened here close by. And all of the governments at Six Nations would have, all the stuff that Joseph Brand would have understood as being ours, right? Can't take it away from us. I'm going to read a little quote from my book. This is Joseph Brandt's words. So like I said, over time he was really upset with the British, because I said, I showed that graphic of our territory that was given versus the reserve that we have left. That was happening in his lifetime. And so he fought back against the British as much as he could. He wrote many, many letters because he was literate, right? We have a lot of those letters. So, he's often seen as an empire loyalist. He's often seen as an advocate for the British, Anglicanism, all that kind of stuff. And here's just an example of kind of how he actually was thinking about the British towards the end of his life, pretty upset with them. So in his speech, this is from 1798 at Niagara, because they often met at Niagara on the lake. He said, "We were promised our lands for our services, and these lands we were to hold on the same footing with those we fled from at the commencement of the American War, when we joined, fought, and bled in your cause." He's talking to the British, right? "Now is published a proclamation forbidding us leasing those very lands that were positively given us in lieu of those of which we were the sovereigns of the soil. Of those lands we have forsaken, we sold, we leased, and we gave away when and as often as we saw fit, without hindrance on the part of your government. For your government well knew we were the lawful sovereigns of the soil, and they had no right to interfere with us as independent nations." And he goes on, but I'm just saying that he understood this government as being independent, that Canada violated, the British and Canada violated their treaty agreements